A few minutes. Sorry for the delay. Hope you've had a nice time talking to each other. It seems pretty vibrant. We'll look forward to hearing about it, and we'll just get started in a few. Thank you all for joining us this morning. This is a continuation of a board meeting that started yesterday. And today we have a number of agenda items remaining, a couple in particular. If I can find my notes. I think I know what they are. Great. I need to start with because it's a new set of players, even though there are a number of the traditional ones. Today is December 17th, and it's 9:20 in the morning, and it's a nice, wet morning, sort of wet. We're celebrating every drop these days, so happy to be here in LA in the rain and in the Met boardroom, which we appreciate the loan of. It's a great facility. Maybe we'll do all our meetings here from now on. That way.
I'd love that.
I know, 3 of us would really like that. In any event, so thank you for joining us. I'm Board Chair Felicia Marcus. To my right is Vice Chair Fran Spivey Weber. To her right, Board Member Stephen Moore. To my left, Board Member Tam Doduck. And to her left, Board Member Didi Diadamo. And we're all very happy to join you. Mr. Howard.
Thank
Can you say who's assisting?
Thank you. To my right, Chief Counsel Michael Laufer. John Bishop is with us and will be joining us soon. And then to his empty chair is Karen Turgovich. Assisting the board today is Janine Townsend and Courtney Davis.
Terrific. And we have some other folks with us who will introduce when we get to those items on the agenda. Thank you all for joining us. But the first item on our agenda, am I forgetting anything? Just tell me. The first item on our agenda is a quick drought update.
Because this mic isn't on. Good morning. We're going to make this rather quick so we can get to our panels, but we thought it was important to update the members on recent activity. So you'll notice, as you mentioned, it is raining out, and it is raining in Northern California as well. But I do want to point out that when we look at some of the more recent U.S. drought monitor conditions for California, that 55% of the state still remains in extraordinary drought conditions. So we're getting precipitation. That's a very good thing, but we need many more storms like the one we've had in the last week to really be able to start to achieve the kind of storage levels that we need to move into the next season. Reservoir conditions also, while they continue to improve, it is slow. If you look at the most recent reservoir conditions for the state's major reservoirs, as of yesterday, we were still well below our historical average, with most of the major reservoirs in the low to mid 30% of their capacity for this time of year. And so we continue to want to see that precipitation fall. Just a brief update on where we are with respect to curtailments. You'll note that we reported to you previously that almost all curtailments have been lifted in the watersheds throughout the state. However, curtailment does still remain in effect in the Deer Creek watershed, but that is related to fish flows. And as a result of current precipitation that's been occurring, that curtailment really is not operative at all because the flows are so high that the water users are certainly meeting the bypass requirements that are in those emergency fish flow regs. I do want to let you know that we did issue about a month and a half ago 22 informational orders to water right holders in the San Joaquin system. The time for response to those orders has passed, and we're now developing additional enforcement cases where warranted for folks that either failed to file or filed and inadequate information was provided. We also recently issued approximately 300 cease and desist notices regarding failure to file of the statements for water right holders, and we will be proceeding to develop those cases, and 50 of those related enforcement actions have recently been issued as final cease and desist orders. So we have issued the draft cease and desist orders, and 50 are now in their final form. And this is pertaining to information that we need relative to data to plan for future dry conditions and in terms of our activities for 2015 going forward. I do want to mention that the Executive Director, Tom Howard, just recently signed a settlement as well related to an enforcement action in the Deer Creek watershed. So I was going to try to keep it short here, but if you have any questions, we will attempt to answer them.
I just have a request. I've had a number of, throughout the last, 6 months, a number of times, people have asked me how many enforcement actions and, basically the list that you've gone through, various questions related to those items. And I know that the whole team that's working on drought is under, a tremendous amount of stress because of the workload, but some way to get that information out just on a updated basis, maybe in the Executive Director's report, where you could just update the various data points that you just went through would be helpful.
We can certainly include that as a regular item.
Other question? All right, there's a part of me that wants to spend more time on this down here because folks down here don't think about the water rights system and all of that, but this isn't here just for an educational exercise. So thank you for that brief update.
And maybe just for the folks in the audience, to put it into context, we issued approximately 9,600 curtailment notices during this past season. So it was quite a significant effort, and Board Member D'Adamo mentioned all of the time that's being spent by the staff in that program, not only on curtailment and the subsequent enforcement actions, but also on planning for a potential dry 2015. But it was quite a large effort this last year in many watersheds throughout the state.
Yeah.
Maybe we could queue up the next drought update in January. We're planning to invite the various federal agencies and WR and Bureau of Reclamation to report on the drought preparation for the coming year. Is there anything you want to note about that?
So under the order, temporary urgency change order that was issued, the projects are preparing to submit a 2015 drought operations plan, and that's due on January 15th to cover their operations as we move into the new calendar year. And as a part of that, they will also be making a presentation to the board. We had, I believe, previously advised you that they would be, because of the extensive presentation that we received at the November board meeting, that they would be returning to provide an update in January.
And I just heard, as I was driving in, there was a report on the snowpack, and it is it's about half of the water content of normal in snowpack. So it's good to be talking about conservation even when it's raining.
All right, it's the theme of the day. Great. The next item, which I think everyone is here for, I assume, is to talk about.
Was at least one comment card, I thought, on item 7. No?
No. Okay. No, it was on an item that was on the agenda. Is to talk about urban water conservation, and we've done this as a workshop because we want your thinking on it. There are some folks who think of it as a very simple issue, and what we found in the course of the months of dealing with it's far from simple. And so we found that doing workshops doesn't always, but can actually help us with our thinking. And as those of you who were with us yesterday heard us say a number of times, we can only speak as a group in public, and it is helpful for us all to hear the same things at the same time and be in conversation, frankly, with the public and the expert public, many of whom are here, to help us think through some next steps. You know, obviously over the last several months, water suppliers and individuals have stepped up to do an impressive amount of conservation on top of some of the conservation that's been done over the past couple or even few decades, particularly in Southern California. And collectively, it's interesting to know the metrics. Collectively, staff estimates that we've saved 100 billion gallons of water. For those of us who think in MGD, I'm looking at you guys, maybe, that seems like a lot. I don't know what it means in acre feet. You had it estimated, it's in the hundreds of thousands of acre feet if you do the math. Engineers, you're all on deck to do the math for me on 100 billion gallons and how many acre feet. But it's really varied throughout the state. And part of what we did earlier this year, because we were seeing resistance to conservation and taking active measures for a variety of reasons, and because we saw the inequity across the state during a time of significant drought, we stepped in to do statewide water conservation measures that were somewhat mild, geared towards saying, okay, it's time to move, focused on outdoor irrigation, and sort of some of them are basic common sense in the sense that we recognize that people didn't realize how much water in the urban residential arena was being used outdoors. So that seemed like the smartest place to ring a bell and get people's attention. We also focused on, and perhaps the most important thing was to get urban water suppliers to step up. We tied it to their drought contingency plans to the level that involved mandatory outdoor, again, to send that message, but also to defer to the thinking that local agencies had been doing. And then we also required monthly reporting. And in some ways, that monthly reporting that's come to the board may have been among the most significant things we did. Initially, it was percentage reduction, month to month, year over year. And then just in the last couple of months, estimates of regional, residential gallons per capita per day to paint a more full picture of the comparative level of effort, not to spank folks who weren't doing it, but to show the art of the possible and what could be done, and to give people a measure of a sense of what others similarly situated were doing. Last month in our report, we got some perplexing signals from the data. Folks were saving more water than they had the month before. Folks were saving more water than they had October of last year compared to this year, but the level of effort seemed to be waning. And as we were able to also look at the gallons per capita per day, we saw a highly variable rate of conservation across the state, and particularly in Southern California compared to the rest. And so we decided to hold this workshop down here, in part because we could also come down here for another issue yesterday that would allow more people to join us, but really to come down here in a community that has been conserving for many decades, to get your best thinking on what we might do next, and if we need to do something next. And we're interested in the full range of ideas of what we might be doing. The ideas could be to tune up our existing conservation regulations, recognizing as we look at different communities, and rightly, in thinking of subsidiarity, we deferred to the drought contingency plans that urban water agencies had put in, but they are apples to oranges in some case. And without making everybody the same apple, there is a wide difference in what folks had been doing. And so we thought, well, maybe we can tune up the regulations we have. Maybe we should go indoors. Maybe we should heighten the level of conservation required outdoors. We're also interested in hearing what you think we should be doing in the long term as well as the short term. Or should some things be permanent? Should we be doing regulations that just make sense at all times, since California is always in a recurring state of water shortage, et cetera? So the sky's the limit. It is a workshop, and we really want your best thinking about how we can best play a role in helping people to step up and treat our water resources as the precious resources that they are. Yesterday, we spent a lot of time, and could have spent a week, on thinking about our water resources from multiple venues of flood control, water supply, water quality, thinking about treating it as a whole integrated system. Today we want to focus on water conservation specifically, which is the cheapest, fastest, smartest way to achieve the best use of our water resources. And we're totally open to your thoughts on the appropriate role for the state in this dialogue, which traditionally has been done at the local level. I think our water conservation regulations, as mild as they were the first statewide regulations in the nation. And that doesn't mean we want to go to town and substitute our judgment for locals, but even though it is raining right now and we are grateful for every single drop, we are not out of this drought, and this will not be the last drought that we have. And so the smartest thing we can do is to figure out how to use our water resources, again, as the precious resource that they are. And many of you in this room have been on the leading edge, I won't say bleeding edge in this case, but really the leading edge of figuring out how to do this. And we know from our experience, not just in certain cities within our state, but looking at the rest of the world, that we can do far more without actually even having a tremendous impact on lifestyle, quality of life, et cetera. If we look at the Australian experience, they were able to set targets that are far lower than urban California is achieving, except in a couple of circumstances. And so there's some low-hanging fruit left. What we'll be doing this morning is we're going to start with a brief staff update, and then we're going to move to two expert panels, one with academic and NGO participants, and then another from water suppliers who are working on these issues day to day. We're then going to take a short break, and then we'll get to public comment and the continuing conversation. And again, no decision today, but really an opportunity for us to sit together, do some thinking together, some conversation, and help us shape our thoughts on where we can go next to help in this arena. I'm not going to go through the questions. I'm going to let you do that, Eric. And with no further ado, I want to turn it to Eric to introduce those that are with him today and to tee us up for the panels.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Marcus, board members. My name is Eric Oppenheimer. Today I have Rafael Maestu with me, as well as Carlos Mejia. Carlos is with Office of Chief Counsel. Rafa and I are with Office of Research Planning and Performance. And we're going to get right into the presentation here. Start out with just kind of a high-level timeline of how we got here. It's been almost a year now, January of last year, since the governor declared the drought, and that was actually the first time within that declaration that the governor called on all Californians to reduce water use by 20%. And then as the drought intensified in April, as you know, the second drought executive order was signed by the governor. And that is where the governor directed the State Water Board to basically evaluate what the urban water suppliers were doing with respect to urban water conservation and determine if sufficient actions were being taken to respond to the drought. So shortly after that April executive order, we issued our voluntary survey to the roughly 400 larger urban water suppliers in the state and asked them a number of questions in terms of what was being done both on a voluntary and a mandatory basis. And I recall the result from that survey was about half of the water suppliers actually had mandatory restrictions in place. Half were voluntary, and at that point the board decided it would be worthwhile to move forward with the emergency regulation. You adopted the emergency regulation July 15th. It was approved by OAL and went into effect July 28th. And then we began collecting the water production data mid-August, and then the per capita water use data more recently in mid-October. The last point is that unless further actions taken, the regulations are set to expire April 24th of 2015. So in the updates that we've been providing to the board thus far, we've primarily been focused on what the large urban water suppliers are doing. These are the ones with more than 3,000 service connections or delivering more than 3,000 acre-feet of water per year. But as you know, the regulation also includes a directive to the smaller urban water suppliers and those without drought contingency plans to either implement 2-day-a-week of watering or comparable measures to the 2-day-a-week watering. So we wanted to get a sense of, what was happening with the small suppliers. So we did an informal assessment where we essentially, very non-scientific, just picked 10 random water suppliers and kind of, made some calls, looked at their websites, and tried to get a sense of what we were doing. And this is essentially the results of that survey. What we found was 40% are providing, a way to report waste on their websites, either an email form or a phone number where people can call in if they observe wasteful practices. 60% had educational materials. And then in terms of restrictions on outdoor irrigation, only 2 out of the 10, 20%, actually limited days per week of irrigation that you could water outdoors, and only 1 had a 2-day-a-week restriction as prescribed in the regulation. One of the suppliers had restrictions on the hours of the day that irrigation was allowed, and then we found that 50%, about half of them, had information on their websites that echoed the prohibited water uses that are in the regulations themselves, and then 10% had hospitality restrictions. So this is like, you've got to ask to have your towels washed in a hotel or ask for water in a restaurant, those types of things. So, based on this very small sample size, to us it looks like, we should probably be doing a little bit more investigation as to what the small suppliers are doing, because it's questionable at this point whether there's full compliance with the regulations with the smalls, and we've really been focused on the large suppliers.
So, green light. So the 50% that are echoing our regulations, where they just, I read some of the press on some of those where they said they were doing it because we made them to, in some cases, which was really not the messaging we wanted them to say, because it helps if it's coming from them. So they just said things like not watering so much that it runs off into the street, and that would, so you assess that, would you assess that 50% as being equivalent to the 2 days per week, or is inadequate?
I don't, we need to look deeper on that, but I probably would, my assessment would be no, it's not equivalent to 2 days a week, because all Californians are supposed to follow those prohibited, 4 prohibited water uses. So to me, the 2 days a week should really sit on top of those uses. Okay. Now, limiting hours per day, that type of thing, or other restrictions, that's where, we would need more information. The flip side of this is that these are small suppliers, right, and we focused on the large suppliers for a reason. I mean, the 400 that we're looking at in more detail, they represent about, I think, 35 million retail customers. That is the vast majority of water use. But that's not to say that we shouldn't, look at every opportunity to conserve water, and there's also a fairness question here.
And I would add that in Southern California, and particularly in the South Bay, which is where I live, there are a lot of CPUC-regulated suppliers, and they don't have police powers. The cities do. And so the cities need to, will have to adopt the water restrictions, the 2 days a week or whatever they are, because they're the ones who can actually enforce those activities. The private companies cannot.
Well, that's important. And there's also, it's analogous but different. It may be that some speakers will raise this today. Another question I didn't flag out there, toss out there at the beginning, is the role of wholesalers. I mean, we have some wholesalers talking. We're sitting in a wholesaler's room, and there are some agencies that felt that they were caught in a funny, bind's not the word, but as they went to implement these restrictions, they had some pushback from some of their users who said, well, why aren't the wholesalers? They're not telling us that we're in a pickle. And it was just some mixed messaging, so we're also open to suggestion on that. We chose going directly with water agencies because it was sort of an across the board fairness question, and we didn't want to send different messages. The drought contingency planning at the wholesale level jumps to water allocation, and we didn't necessarily want to jump there if we didn't have to. But thoughts on whether we should be addressing wholesalers in some way, shape, or form would be helpful.
Well, and one other thing that I would mention for those of you who are going to be coming up, there is state law that sets standards for indoor water use. And there's guidance in a couple of bills that were passed and signed that direct attention to outdoor water use. And so those things are in statute. What can we do to build on those? We don't want to have to go and do new legislation if it's not necessary, and perhaps it's not. So I'll be very curious to hear your comments on how we build on what's there. A lot of people just simply don't know what's there.
So this next slide it addresses the largest of the large suppliers. So the regulation requires that each of the urban water suppliers implement the first stage of their contingency plan that has a restriction on outdoor water use. And as we've talked about, that can mean a lot of different things. So we wanted to look a little deeper and did some research similar to what we did with the smalls, but we looked at the 25 largest suppliers. So these are all the water suppliers serving more than 200,000 people, and collectively they represent almost 15 million people. So it's a lot. And the way this chart works is it shows the number of days along the x-axis along the bottom that watering is allowed within for each, and then the bars represent the number of suppliers. So essentially reading this, there's 4 suppliers that allow watering 1 day a week. There's 8 suppliers that allow watering every day, so there's no daily restriction. Now, they may have an outdoor restriction on water use, but that's going to be something like you cannot water, during the very hot part of the day. So the idea here is just that we need to be mindful that not all outdoor water use restrictions are the same or going to result in the same level of conservation. What's interesting here is that we also looked at, well, can we glean something in terms of how much water is being saved based on number of days? And the data really was all over the map. You couldn't look and say, the people that allowed watering only 1 day a week saved the most water, and the people who allowed watering every day saved the least water. It didn't work out like that. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting to look at the diversity of restrictions here, number of days per week that's allowed. The other thing I'll mention on this slide is, that in terms of reporting, we did send out last month 10 notices of violations to the folks who weren't reporting, and now we have 100% reporting. So we identified some that just weren't subject to the regulation, but everybody who we think is supposed to be reporting now is reporting. That's great. I think Ralph will show you this slide, but we still have 38 suppliers that are self-reporting that they have not implemented a mandatory outdoor restriction, so technically we don't think they're in compliance. We've sent those 38 suppliers about 10 days a week ago, maybe 2 weeks, compliance letters essentially saying, we see you're not indicating that you've got a restriction. Can you explain to us how you believe you're in compliance or comply with the regulation? So we are following up there.
Oh, that's good. Thanks for addressing the enforcement question. I was going to ask that.
So this is essentially just a series of questions that we would like to have the data to respond to, and they kind of go from the questions that we can answer pretty easily already with the data that we have and the questions that we're far from being able to answer. And really the first two, where and when is water being used, the amount of information we're collecting, the way we're collecting, we can answer that question. We can determine who's conserving water. What we don't know is what conservation actions are in place because we're not asking that question at this point. And we don't know, as I just mentioned, what's working and what's not. Additionally, how is the water being used? We think that would be valuable information to know the breakdown between indoor and outdoor water use by supplier. And that might help answer that last question about what's the overall potential for water conservation that we think is important. And
Can I ask I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Of course.
So That suggests, I mean, people can answer the question here, but it also suggests that if we were going to tune up our regulations, we might want to put some of those questions into it as again, if we were going to do a collective conversation about where we might go next. I'd add I'm sorry, I keep adding questions I'd like people to address. I should have done them all at once, but there are other things we could think about, given if you look at the Australian experience, again, we're more diverse. We're not actually more diverse than they are in terms of terrain within our state. We're bigger and more complex, but they actually, by state and locality, set pretty aggressive targets, ranging from 35 gallons per person per day to 45 gallons per person per day in major cities, and they made it, and they still have yards and stuff. They just are dealing with different ways to manage that. Also, we could think about, is there something we could do on landscape ordinances in general? Is there something we could do on pricing in general, which I think some of our speakers will talk about? So targets, pricing, landscape ordinance. There's a whole passel of tools that have been used in various communities in California. We don't have to look to Australia that we want to try and replicate.
Yeah. If I could add, and I appreciate you bringing that up, Chair Marcus, that there are a number of things to look at in Australian experience on this, and we will. But one thing that you touched on in your introduction was the importance of absolutely having to know how much water people are using, the importance of measurement. And I think, staff will speak to that too today, but I just want to emphasize that, and not just in urban areas, but in all water users. That's the first step based on that 12-year drought, in terms of solving problems. And so, be interested in folks' input in terms of what type of information we should be collecting to keep track of water use, and then set appropriate targets accordingly.
Well, and if I could just add to that, not just what type of information, but what works for people. And this is kind of more the psychology of what type of information motivates people. So to the extent that districts or those that are involved in studying this have information about, is it gallons per day? Is it some way to measure how you compare with your neighbors? What is it that actually motivates people to change?
And I would just pile on, technology. What are there new technologies that are out there that will make this more cost effective? If everybody's got to put a meter on their outdoor and their indoor water use, I mean, that's going to take time, and that's very costly. Are there cheaper ways to go? I'm sure there are, and I look forward to hearing about that.
Yeah, I would say on the information side, that's probably the one area where I've got the most positive feedback from just people, media, but private citizens and water agencies. Just in general, we've got a lot of really positive feedback in putting the data out, and that's what this slide essentially talks about, our approach, doing it frequently, getting it out there, updating it frequently. Even, the residential per capita water use data, which was sort of a new thing, there's been a lot of interest in that, and a lot of positive input on getting that information out there. I think it's been helpful for people. I don't think people know how much water, a lot of people don't know how much water they actually use. So, our approach, like I said, frequent collection every month. It's focusing only on the large suppliers at this point. And this idea of keeping it simple, measuring the critical few, I mean, that's been good. We took a really light touch in terms of what we asked for. We put the online tool together very quickly. We made it as easy as possible for suppliers, we think, to provide the information. We've got a lot of good feedback on that, although the tool itself can be a little quirky. But we really, there's other information that I believe could be helpful. But we really try to take a light touch and ask for what's most critical. We don't want to be careful too not to ask for so much information and then not use it. If we use it, great, but if we're not going to use it, we don't want to collect it.
So that also suggests to the audience and the speakers that if there's another critical piece of info or two that we should be asking for, that illuminating would be helpful. We're all ears.
Exactly, and that's one of the questions that we put out as part of the workshop notice, and we'll close with those questions. And just to get our approach to get more information has essentially been asking, calling people and asking them. It's just not very rigorous or as effective as it could be. But that's kind of how when we have questions as to what's going on here, we're calling people. That's our approach.
Yeah, good morning, Rafael Maestro. So these are the set of metrics that we choose to collect for the water suppliers. Obviously, we want to know about the water production. We want to know the percentage of that water production that is used for residential. We want to know the population that the water suppliers serve. We also want to know the performance, how much actually percentage of the water is being conserved, and we compare that with the 2013 data. Then we calculate the residential gallons per capita per day, but we also ask the water suppliers to provide that information to us to see if there are any discrepancies in the method that we use to calculate that. And we have a methodology and a guidance how to do that. And then we obviously ask about, what are they doing to conserve water, like including the mandatory restrictions. So one of the issues that, as Eric mentioned, we want to keep it very simple. But we also face that we see outliers, we see the reports that they're not easy to explain. So we may need additional data to be able to evaluate the results. So we are here in South Coast, and there's a good reason for that. Is because the South Coast produces 56% of the water. And there are 173 water suppliers. Out of the 413 in the state, they serve 20 million Californians, and as I say, they use 56% of the water. So we are using a set of metrics. The first metric that we're going to report today, we're going to include some information for you, is the monetary restrictions. And as Eric mentioned before, we have now 91% of the water suppliers are imposing monetary restrictions. For the South Coast, the percentage is very similar. I mean, it's basically the same. So we see no differences there.
So that means 1 or 2.
Hmm?
It's not 100. It's
18. Okay, yeah, 18.
Yeah.
18 water suppliers in South Coast are not imposing monetary, or they're not reporting that they are. They don't have monetary.
And they're the ones you sent the letters to?
Yes.
Okay.
So the second metric that we're using is the water production. And then we can use this data to show the trends. And this is statewide. This is information that we provide to you at the last board meeting. So it's showing the trends, and it's comparing the 2014 data with the 2013, month by month. So total, we have saved 90 billion gallons of water. And with the November data that we actually received, the deadline for the data was on Monday. So we're still analyzing it, of course. But we predict that we're going to have approximately 100 billion gallons of water savings. When we look at the when we look at the South Coast, we see a similar trend. In the South Coast, it was safe, even though they have 56% of the water, they saved 20 billion gallons.
Right, so it's significant, but Southern California dragged down the curve.
Correct. And we're going to show that. There you go. So, as Felicia mentioned before, I mean, we see tremendous variability in the data. I mean, so the third metric that we're using is the percentage reduction. And here we show the percentage reduction for the month of October by hydroelectric region. The South Coast saved 1.4%, but regions like the Sacramento River were at much higher, which 18.6%, and San Francisco Bay by 15.5%.
Right, and one of the counter arguments, I'm sorry, just to eliminate, one of the, not counter arguments, one of the points that folks in South Coast will raise is in the Sacramento River area, the gallons per capita per day is higher, and so it's a percentage reduction off a higher water use, which is a fair point. But then you look, as an Angelino, I hate to say it, but you look at the San Francisco Bay Area, which has similar or lower gallons per capita per day to Southern California, and they're still up high. So it's not all rosy there. And weather plays a little bit, but it can't explain the whole thing.
Yeah, and we have been tracking this information month by month. So we are showing the trend in water conservation. This is statewide. We saw an increase in water conservation in the first 3 months, and then we saw a decrease in water conservation that may be explained partially by weather. The preliminary data we collected for November, it actually is positive. We see a range, of around 10% water conservation for the month of November, and that we will be reporting to you in the January board meeting. So when we saw, and this is a question that Didi asked at the last board meeting, it's like, if we separate South Coast from the rest of the state, what would the average will look like? And so the green is the state without the South Coast, the blue is all the state, and then the red one is just the South Coast. And you can see the water conservation rates are much greater in average, for the rest of the state than for the South Coast. So the four metric that we're using is the residential gallons per capita day. And we see that the values are really, there's a high variability in the information. We see, water suppliers reporting 500 gallons per capita per day to 50 gallons per capita per day. So there's a lot of things that we need to look into to really understand what drives that level of consumption. And as Fran said before, I mean, the indoor water use, the standard is 55 gallons per capita. So this is a combination of the performance, basically the percentage reduction, and the gallons per capita day, the average for each hydrological region. The South Coast regions have a lower, gallons per capita day than the inland regions. The South Coast is at 107 gallons per capita day. So if we use the standard of 55 gallons for indoor, the difference will be the water that is used outdoors. So we look at this graph shows the 24 suppliers in the South Coast which gallons per capita day is greater than 200 gallons. I didn't put the names of each one of them, but you can also see the percentage reduction that they are achieving for the month of October. This is
all over the map, or am I just not able to see it?
And you can see many of them not only using a lot of water.
They haven't done much.
But the conservation is actually negative. They're actually using more water than last year.
What's the deal on the 33% up? Yeah, is that down or up?
That's actually using more water. They're using
more
water.
Right, so the key here is that the negative means the
No
percent,
conservation.
yeah, which is less performance
Less
on
performance,
conservation, yeah.
So we have many ways of showing and displaying the data, and we try to work, this is what we do in the Office of Research Planning and Performance. We try to, find ways of communicating the information. And one of the things that we did is to put these,
Could we go back? Sorry,
Yeah,
could we
sure.
go back? Of course, you're not naming them, and that's not what this is all about here. This is looking at it, as examples for future actions. But are there reasons for this based on your analysis, just cursory analysis?
Reasons for the high water use?
Yeah.
The high per capita?
I mean, is there anything that would explain it in that month?
Well, like I said, we don't have the data to absolutely tell you why. But what we have done is made some phone calls. So anecdotally, in talking to 5 or 6 of these suppliers that have these really high rates, what they've told us is they have very large lot size. A few have mentioned that their service area serves an affluent population, so they're not sensitive to the price of water, and that the weather was hotter this year compared to last year, but that doesn't, that affects the amount they saved, but not their per capita water use as much. and that they just live in hot climates, some hot climates with sandy soils, those types of factors. So it's not, I think lot size is probably one of the biggest factors.
The interesting thing too is looking at folks that are sort of similarly situated and have a range of reduction levels. So again, maybe they're in a different climate, but everybody wants to know who the 33% is, but maybe they had broken pipelines or something. Sometimes there can be a reason.
It's all public. We didn't want to name them for purpose of a presentation, but we have all the information, in tabular format. We're posting it.
And to be honest, I don't think when you come up and don't start defending your number.
Yeah, please.
Don't do that. We're moving forward. This is what we've got to work with. What do we need in order to do better in the future? And if we shouldn't be doing something, you can write it to us in a letter.
That's true. There's a couple of dimensions. There's a long-term goal of getting a new normal in terms of Californians and our relationship to water, but also there's an evaluation of how did Californians respond to a drought emergency, and how can we do better? How can we get the word out? Because as water professionals, it's on us to really get the word out and to persuade folks how important our dependence on sustainable water resources really is. So, we're all collectively going through this and looking for ways to get the message across. And, and again, you look at Australia, they have some suggestions on things that worked to really get the mass population awareness of water really come home every day. And maybe that's part of what we're trying to achieve. Thanks.
So we're trying to analyze the data and use the data and display the information in multiple ways. One of the things that we are showing here, we are comparing the two metrics that we are actually using, basically the percentage reduction, which is the axis on the left, and the gallons per capita day, which is measured on the horizontal axis over here. So here shows the size of the balloons are actually the population of each region. And you can see the South Coast, it has a much greater population than the other regions. And the red lines show basically the average, which is 104 gallons per capita day, and a percentage reduction, which is 6.5%. So those regions in this area here, they are not reducing the water basically enough, and they're not conserving water, but they also have a high gallons per capita day. On the contrary, the regions on this side, they are the best performers. Basically, they are conserving water, and their gallons per capita day is low. And then we have South Coast kind of like in the center, which drives the average. So, but as we said before, we see a tremendous variability in data. And this is just a balloon for each water supplier, just the South Coast.
You did everyone. These are all the South Coast water
This
suppliers.
is just the South Coast water suppliers, and each one of them. So you can see the size of each water supplier. I mean, we know, who they are basically. But so then in
Now I'm thinking dipping dots.
Stand up if you see yourself.
So in this side, we have the ones who are not
That's
performing
interesting.
well. Yeah. And then over here, we actually the ones who are performing very well. And then on this side, it's kind of mixed. The big one is obviously the.
Yeah. What's the second biggest one?
I think San Diego.
That's right, because they're 76. Mm-hmm.
So we're trying to be as transparent as possible in this data collection process, and all the information is available for the public. And we're trying to improve the ways we are actually communicating the information so it's more useful. The next slide.
So this is true. So some of those 500 are these little bubbles. They're little bubbles.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually instructive because they stand out, but they're little.
Yeah.
Which is not to say they're not important, but I mean, if you're looking at where to focus your effort, other than the fairness issue, which is an important one to people.
So we will just close out with the questions for the workshop. So As part of the workshop notice, we included a series of questions in there, just basically to help prime the discussion, and we actually talked to the panelists about these questions as well. And the first two questions really revolve around what more can, not only the State Water Board do, but can the local water suppliers, what more, should we do in the near term to increase water conservation? And then, what additional requirements could the board consider taking, especially if the drought conditions persist, if we continue to see drought into the new year. And as we've talked about, we're still in drought, even though the rainfall is great news. We certainly have a long way to go. The third question, what can be done to essentially improve better performance in those areas on the chart that Rafa just brought up where they're not performing as well? And maybe poor performing is not the best term, but essentially where we see high per capita water use and low levels of conservation compared to last year. Should we be focusing on those areas? And if so, what should focusing look like in terms of requirements? And then the fourth question, what additional data, and we've talked a lot about this today already, but what additional data should we be collecting and how would it be used? And then lastly, any other ideas for incentivizing permanent conservation enhancements as we move forward? And I don't think that question was on the notice for the workshop, but it's also an area that we've heard some interest in. So with that, we're happy to answer any questions, but we also can turn it back over to the board, to you, Chair Marcus.
Thank you. One other question, I'm sorry, maybe I should have been more organized at the beginning. One of the things, and you referenced it, that we've done in past droughts when we didn't have the authority to do conservation regulations like we did this time, was to use our waste and reasonable use authority to talk about specific practices or in specific cases in specific areas. And that's certainly something we could do too. Everything does not have to be across the board. So I do want to leave that open. I don't know, Carlos Mejia, Council, if you want to explain in a minute what that authority is. Yeah. Just to throw another tool on the table that we might consider using. Everything doesn't have to be regulatory.
Right, and so just to distinguish very briefly between the two, what you first alluded to, Chair Marcus, is the authority that the board possesses pursuant to Water Code Section 1058.5. That was adopted by the legislature earlier this year and signed into law, and that allows the board to adopt emergency regulations during drought years for, among other things, conservation. The waste and unreasonable use authority that the board possesses is much broader, and it's enshrined in the California Constitution at Article 10, Section 2, and simply put allows the board to regulate and stop wasteful or unreasonable uses of water. And the board has, as you also alluded to in past droughts, used that to target specific actions, specific types of actions, and specific projects. So that's certainly something we can explore moving forward. And I, of course, would join in with my colleagues in ORPP in welcoming thoughts from our panelists today and from our commenters on what those types of activities might be.
That's right, and that's an authority that we can use for more permanent. We can either vote targeted things during a drought or more permanent.
That's right. So 1058,
declarations.
Correct. 1058.5 applies only during drought years. Waste unreasonable use authority is constant.
Great.
Could I just ask one?
Yeah, sure.
So I appreciate Eric's point there in the slide, looking a little more granularly at what might be the causes of less performance versus greater performance. And you went into that a little bit at our last hearing, and today you talked about following up by phone on some of the nuances. I would acknowledge the efforts of Aqua to try to also gather this type of information, and what I'm getting at is that when we talked about mandatory outdoor conservation measures, those were very heterogeneous. There was a great deal of variety of what that meant for each of these, all the bubbles, or all the moons and planets is where my head goes when I see that graph. But the universe of water suppliers. So what I'm getting at is I'm interested in, if maybe even with comments today, to learn about some of this nuance about what conservation measures and mandatory conservation measures and urban water management plans really are showing effectiveness in terms of behavioral outcomes. And what can we learn from our neighbors on what worked and what can we replicate at different water suppliers. That's just kind of one of my areas of interest. Thanks.
No, I think that's great. Figuring out how to replicate what works is a better way to go than spanking those that are bad. So to the extent we can figure out how to leverage that, it would be terrific. Well, now we're going to move to our panel, and we're going to have two panels, and I really want to thank the folks in advance on both panels. They all come with a wealth of experience, and I'm not going to go into their entire bios, but just say that we're delighted to have them all with us. And I think I'm going to go through all of them first to give people a sense of who's coming, but just know that for everything I mentioned about them, there are 10 other phenomenal things that they've done in the past. On the non-governmental panel, first we'll have Madeline Glickfeld, who is the Assistant Director for Outreach and Strategic Initiatives for the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. Yes, I have to read this, even though I know you well, because it's so long. And she's also the Director of the UCLA Water Resources Group, and she's been a member of the LA Regional Water Quality Board for many years and has worked in state government and been just a part of water issues in Southern California for a very long time. Next will be Tracy Quinn from the Natural Resources Defense Council. Tracy is a professional engineer and a policy analyst with the water program at the Natural Resources Defense Council, where she focuses on water conservation and efficiency policy, as well as working on product standards, which is obviously the gift that keeps on giving once it happens. So thank you. We also have Gary Brown, the Orange County Coast Keeper. He is the founder and the president of the Coast Keeper, as well as the Inland Empire Water Keeper, and he's no stranger to water issues himself, as well as not just the coast, but also groundwater, which is an interesting and wonderful combination of things. And he has also been involved in many pilot programs across the water quality and water supply spectrum. And last but not least, we'll have joining us Tim Brick with the Alliance for Water Efficiency. And Tim Brick is no stranger to this room, having been on the Metropolitan Board and been its chair for many years. And he is representing, as I said, the Alliance for Water Efficiency, which is, I'd say, the nation's leading organization focusing on the tools and experience necessary to get where we need to go on water efficiency. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it to Madeline first. And then a question, we have the panel scheduled for an hour. I'm assuming that you've all been told to talk for less than a full 15 minutes so that we can have a conversation. So how much time is she putting on the meter for each person? 10? Okay, and the shorter you can do it, the more time we have for conversation, so.
Thank you for inviting me, Marcus and members of the board. I'm very familiar with this room. Our board meetings, and I'm delighted to have you here. It's very important to people in Southern California to have the opportunity to talk. I know people go up there, but that's a large number of people to show up for a hearing down here, so I'm very glad you're here. So I have probably more slides than I have time for. I printed them up so that you have them.
Great.
Pretty much everything I'm going to say is on these slides. So here are the focus areas that I'm going to be talking about. So if you can, just look at this. We think you need to do what you can to encourage new tier pricing for residential high water users. I think that you need to work with the urban water agencies to measure water use and water loss better than we're doing right now. We don't really have good measures of either. We think you need to focus on both water conservation by the users and efficient water distribution system, which is the other side of that. That's why you look at loss. And encourage large-scale commercialization and deployment of gray water systems by using new or existing certification systems to assure safety, providing rebates, and allowing for simple permitting. Finally, the first four things are really what I'm going to talk about today, but I'm going to add into the mix that you think about ways to encourage local or state legislation to require that all new development is designed with water savings and water reuse features as well as LID features, which are already required by some regional boards and some cities. In fact, all of the cities within our regional board are doing LID. But one of the reasons that I'm making these recommendations for you is that I want you to think about the difference between the water boards and DWR and how you relate to the conservation issue and the Energy Commission and the Air Resources Board. So the Energy Commission in the 80s and 90s achieved enormous conservation without anybody paying attention to it, just by requiring better appliance efficiency. We did enormously better than the state. But we really haven't been able, and the State Air Resources Board brought us non-gasoline engines and greater mileage engines as a way to control both climate change and air pollution. You haven't had that ability, or at least the staffing, to do that kind of work. But I urge you to think about how you translate what the Energy Commission has done and what the Air Resources Board has done to get the technology in place that will help us manage water better. And certainly having houses, we have the technology now to design houses that are water saving with water saving devices. We already use those, but we also have water reuse features. So Australia didn't get to 40 gallons per minute by everybody taking one shower every 6 weeks. They got there by actually paying people to put gray water systems in and actually encouraging them to develop their own water savings by putting cisterns in. So I'm going to share with you for the rest of my minutes what work we have done at UCLA, others have done, and I've done at UCLA on the first 4 items.
Great.
So there's been a study of residential water consumption in LA by Carolyn Minnie, Terry Hogue, and Stephanie Pincel. It was published in 2013, and it was done with the cooperation of the LA Department of Water and Power. They gave them all of their billing data over years of time, and they gave them water usage at the same time for every street address for all single-family residents in the city of LA. And so they were able to do a spatial analysis of water use in LA, and these are the findings that came from that. First of all, income is the primary driver of water consumption. It means more than bigger lots. It means more than higher temperatures. It means more than larger numbers of people per household, and any other statistic that you could come up with. Outdoor water use accounts for 54% of single-family residential water across the city. And you can ask me more about what these greenness studies mean, which is, I think the fact that it indicates overwatering is just a suggestion that you ask me about it later, but that's something that's important to know, that people don't have a good sense of how much water you use, even for their existing landscaping. So then what she found was mandatory restrictions are much more effective than voluntary restrictions and have the highest impact on these high-income users that are high water users. And then when water prices increase, water consumptions for all households decrease, regardless of income, neighborhood, or water use level. And that single-family residential households across all income and water use groups seem to respond to increases in the LADWP's Tier 1 rates more than they do to the Tier 2 rates, which means the bigger users are less responsive to increases in water rates. And what their conclusion is that these higher water rates for higher income people are just not high enough for them to respond to.
So that doesn't suggest...
who think they pay a lot for water are not going to like hearing that, but in fact there are some people that are not responsive to price at the current pricing levels. So concluding, what they said was the greatest reduction of water uses resulted from combining mandatory watering restrictions and price increases. In July and August of 2009, the city of LA saw a reduction of 23% for those 2 years. So those are the combinations that got the kinds of reductions that you'd like to see happen now.
Go ahead and talk about greenness.
Oh, well, I should go back then. So here's what she did. She did a remote sensing analysis looking at a greenness index over time of landscaping, private landscaping. And she found that there wasn't very much difference between droughts when people were actually cutting back in water and regular times when they weren't cutting back on water. And her conclusion, which I think is accurate, is that people are overwatering. There's further work by Hogue to indicate there's a lot of water going down from irrigation going down into the groundwater basin. In fact, the courts in LA, in the San Fernando Valley adjudication, recognize that, and every city gets 10% of their water allocation back because that water goes down into the groundwater basin. So I think it's
if we knew it all went in the groundwater basin,
Yeah,
that might be a good thing, but it doesn't all go in.
If we all did what the Irvine Ranch Water District was doing and had really good controls on watering systems, these numbers could be brought down quite a bit. I suspect people are taking out their lawns and still overwatering because they don't really know
how much to water what they have.
So here's the strange thing, though. You would think that if you reduce during a period of drought and you see that your lawn didn't die, that you would maintain that level after the drought.
I wish
What's
I were a
the disconnect?
psychologist and knew the answer to that question. So these are the recommendations that came from the Pincel study. They propose either an increase in block rate structure with more than 2 tiers in which the unit price for water rises as the volume of water increases, or combining a increasing block structure with seasonal rate structures in which prices increase during the summer months to curb demand during the high demand months. And she also says that we should start investing in this very expensive dual smart metering system at each connection so consumers understand both their indoor and outdoor water. This will help behavior more than anything, but it's an expensive thing to do.
Well, the same would be true also for requiring metering for individual residences in a condo association or in apartments.
That's right. And that I think that apartment owners and condo associations, since they don't want to pay each other's water bills, are sort of incentivized to do that.
Yeah, I don't know that many of them have done it, though.
All right, so I'm going to turn to a different topic now. It's my feeling, and I certainly wish I had seen the staff's presentation before I wrote this stuff, so I might be amending some of these recommendations on the fly. Certainly, I agree with you that the 20% across the board cuts on a month-by-month basis have been a mixed bag, and that many regions and water agencies have cut use for a long time and others have just started. The data up there doesn't reflect it, so there's got to be something else going on. But the question is, should all agencies in all regions be held to the same reduction standard if they in fact are lower in the per capita use? So I think that the combination of these two metrics are really important. So I think that the board has just required all these urban agencies to provide estimates of per capita use per residential, but the system that you've provided is great for the emergency, not good enough if you go on, and I highly recommend that this is becoming, if this is the new normal for our weather, and it has certainly been for the last 7 years, we should have this per capita rate up, and we should be looking at reductions during droughts, but we need to make the data better. So I'm suggesting that we improve the per capita water use indicators to explain these so that you can compare them better from place to place. Oh, there I go. So I am recommending that. I think that you'll see the rest of my recommendations on there, and I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
No, that's great. I look forward to seeing all of them.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Tracy Quinn. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today and share some ideas on actions the board can take to mitigate this drought and prepare California for future dry periods. The theme of NRDC's recommendations fall into 3 categories. First, we identified some data gaps that we think would be helpful to be filled. So we have some suggestions for additional data that can be collected in the monthly reporting that's being done by urban suppliers now. We've also identified some existing laws and policies that are maybe lacking some teeth and could benefit from stronger enforcement and assistance with implementation. And finally, there are a lot of funding opportunities within California, particularly with the bond and SRFs, that can be leveraged to create additional conservation throughout the state. As mentioned a few times today, price signals are an important tool in the conservation toolbox. A recent study from here in Southern California showed that introducing increasing block rate structures reduced demand by 18%, with no appreciable impact on fiscal balance. So, as this drought persists, it's important to know what steps water suppliers are taking to maintain financial solvency and whether conservation messaging is being backed up by proper price signals. I think it's important for the board to familiarize itself with the landscape of California's current rate structures as it considers how to approach drought response measures. It's also important for the board to have information on some of the current measures water suppliers are taking to address revenue shortfalls. In particular, the board should collect data to evaluate how effective drought surcharge rates have been in not only reducing demand, but helping suppliers maintain financial solvency. These are moving on their own. Sorry.
The piece of this, just to put it in layman's or layperson's terms, is there's an allegation that's been made by a number of people, including reporters, that while that there are some agencies that are going through the motions on water conservation because their rate structures are still a rate structure where they support their efforts through pricing water as a commodity, rather than having one of, and I'm sure Tim will talk about this, having one of a rate structure that allows them to pay for the service as well as do some kind of tiering so that they're covering their institutional infrastructure and costs, and then
exactly.
charging for the extra cost it takes to provide more water.
Yes,
I'm not saying that well, but.
Yeah, and I think that there are various ways to go about maintaining financial solvency when you have variability in the water usage in your area, and particularly with the shortages we see during drought. And one of those mechanisms is our drought surcharge rates.
Right, that's the simplest.
That can help you recover some of those losses when you see your sales fall. And so I think that's one thing that hasn't really been evaluated, that data hasn't been collected, and being able to look at that to see how effective that tool has been in maintaining solvency is important. So we have some recommendations for data that the board could consider or should consider including in the monthly urban supplier reports. First, the effective date inscription of the current rate schedule, comparison of forecasted revenues and revenues received year to date, and then the measures used to address revenue shortfalls. I've talked about some of them: surcharge rates, excessive use penalties, etc. Oh, no, it's not working. There we go. Water loss has also been a theme here today. It's also an opportunity for us to collect some additional data. Those of us in Southern California who live in this area might recognize that photo as the DWP break that flooded UCLA. Water main breaks like this one, they get a lot of attention, and they're terrible messaging during a drought. And so there's a current BMP under the California Urban Water Conservation Council that requires urban water suppliers to maintain a record of the repair reported leaks. By daylighting this information, the board can encourage more management attention to improving performance in this area. We recommend that this data, I've included some of the required reporting data from the council BMP, be reported on a monthly basis to the board. There's already an AWWA template that can be used, a standardized template that can be used to report this information. And AWWA also has a benchmark for main breaks per mile. I believe it's 15 breaks per mile per year that the board could consider as a potential standard after it collects sufficient data from water suppliers in the state. Getting to existing laws and policies that could use a little assistance. SB 407 was enacted in 2009 to speed up the replacement of inefficient plumbing fixtures within the state. It's a great idea. It has the potential for incredible savings. There's some estimates that you can see up there. Simply with replacing inefficient toilets, there's estimates that we could save 90,000 acre feet a year. The problem is that the bill merely authorizes cities and counties and water suppliers to enact local ordinances. It doesn't require them to. And so there's been a lot of trouble getting this policy in place and having it be an effective tool. So we're recommending that the state board require retail water suppliers to develop and implement a local enforcement strategy to achieve the replacement of these inefficient fixtures.
Tracy, do you have any rough estimates on how many voluntary ordinances have occurred based on this?
I don't have that information now, but I can get that to you.
Right. But it hasn't been zero, though.
I don't know. I don't think it's zero.
But like you say, it's been, the voluntary nature has made it not a widespread occurrence.
Exactly.
Can I ask you, since we're on a picture of a toilet, dual flush. Where's the thinking on dual flush toilets like they have in Australia? Everywhere. I know we have them in this building, we have them in, but why aren't we requiring those to be the state of the art?
I think there is still some debate about whether the dual flush are going to be more effective than the 1.28 or the even lower flush toilets that are on the market now. I think Niagara has a toilet that will flush regularly at 0.8 and doesn't have a flapper, so it loses that, doesn't have that potential for leakage that traditional toilet design does. So I think that dual flush are a really great tool, and they're incredible, but there are the technology is moving and the design, product design is moving in a way that there are other options as well where you wouldn't want to restrict.
Where you can save some. Thank you.
Another fun picture. Again, there's a lot of ways you can find out if you have a leak, one being flooding LAX parking lot.
Can you help me understand what that guy under the truck is actually trying to do, since he's not Superman?
I hope he's not trying to pull it out, but there's a lot of different ways in which we can locate leaks, in which we can, in which way we can reduce water loss in our distribution systems. There's a study that was done that shows that we lose nearly 900,000 acre feet in distribution system losses, and that 350,000 acre feet of that could be effectively eliminated. So we need to start building tools, as Madeline said, that can help us to reduce that. There's a new law that was passed this fall.
I have a question on that.
Sure.
I was in Sacramento on a tour, take a look at some of their metering projects, and then also pipe replacement and, the wireless tools that they have in order to monitor leaks. Do you have any idea on the percentage, when pipes are replaced, the percentage that also include that technology to monitor?
I don't have that information, I'm sorry. So earlier this fall, SB 1420 was enacted, and it requires urban water suppliers to start including a standardized water loss audit with their urban water management plans in 2015. Water loss reduction begins with water loss reporting, but it's really only as good as the data that's used to fill out that audit form. So NRDC reviewed several of the water loss reports that have been submitted to the California Urban Water Conservation Council as part of their BMP, and found significant variability in the quality of the data that was used. And so what we're recommending that the state board consider here is soliciting funding for a validation study or a validation project in line with what's done in Georgia. Water loss audits are also required in Georgia and Texas, but Georgia has taken sort of a unique approach and not only required the audits, but also established a process for validating the water loss audits prior to submission using SRF funding. And they're also developing a certification process. Okay, I'll be quick. My last slide here is about leveraging funding opportunities. In Governor Brown's executive draft declaration in April, he asked, I think this is number 5, all state agencies that distribute funding for projects to require recipients to have appropriate conservation and efficiency programs in place. And this is already part of some funding through AB 1420. As mentioned earlier, NRC has found some shortcomings in that process as well. And there's a lot of money on the table here that could be leveraged for additional conservation. So I'll just briefly say that DMM requirements have never been applied to SRF loans and grants, and they've only been applied to direct applicants of bond funds and not recipients of any pass-through funding. And so having the bonding applied to all recipients of funding and meeting the requirements that I put up there that I think would be incredibly helpful. So I just summarized, we need more data. We need to actively and effectively enforce the policies that we do have, and I think leveraging our funding to create opportunities is another.
Great, thank you. It's great. All very thoughtful. Mr. Brown. I'm assuming we're just interrupting. We have questions, so.
Oh, okay. Sure.
That doesn't look good. It wasn't the blue screen of death, at least, but it wasn't good. This is cool. So there's a room within a room, within a room, within a room, within a room. That's pretty cool.
There it went. There it is. Yes.
Oh my God, that's your logo? That's the best logo ever. Yeah, I hadn't seen that. That's really good.
You keep trying, you finally get there.
Really good.
I want to thank you for the opportunity to address you today and talk about some recommendations. Mine will be framed more in on-the-ground aspects and particularly in landscaping and use. I think that's kind of the lowest hanging fruit that we should all go after. My comments today also are representative of the California Coast Keeper Alliance. As you know, there are 12 keeper programs in the state of California. From the 30,000 foot level in a long term, and something we've been saying for a long time is what particularly Southern California needs is a resiliency plan, a plan to take us in the future. And it can have more, but we're suggesting that it have a minimum of 4 basic pillars. And the first being promote the development of indirect potable, and how do we expedite the development procedures to get to direct potable reuse. And I'm not at all saying some of these aren't on the way, but it's something that
2016, be there.
Yes, Southern California needs to agree on a plan, buy into it, and so we're all on the same page going forward. And that, surprisingly enough, is something we really don't have today. We have to expand policies. The second leg would be to expand policies and regulations to ensure greater water use efficiency, especially landscape. Those photographs are actually with the two sides our grant we had from Metropolitan Water District some years ago to actually take front yards and retrofit them as demonstrations. The center one, we have a 3-acre garden, water demonstration garden that we have 1,000 to 1,500 people a month come and visit. We have classes there. We have all kinds of programs, but we've been on this track since 2005. The third is raise a funding priority for restoring contaminated aquifers. We talk about the long-term need, and there's studies that show that there's 13 million gallons of potential underground storage here in Southern California if we would just clean them up. And it's got to be a higher funding priority than it is.
Got it in the water bond.
And certainly the fourth would be to develop more of efficiency and moving water within regions from where it's located to where it's most needed. This is something that gets into the water appropriations, water rights. It gets into, you know, when we assess people to do, say, basin restoration, you know, they've got to have benefit of it. We've got to more efficiently be able to move water around within regions. And so, you know, these are 4 basic pillars that would be a part of the Southern California resiliency plan going forward. As far as getting more down in specific recommendations, we had proposed the state board considering hiring as state board employees and place in each of the urban regional boards a water use efficiency officer. And I'm gonna keep using water use efficiency because, you know, you've probably heard many times, water conservation is something you do to respond to a drought. Water use efficiency is something you do every day. And so I think what we decide, what your actions are, is something that we should do every day. And what this position would do, and I think it would be incredibly useful because of all of the metrics, all of the things we talk about, you know, there's differences in areas. In one area that has large residential units and quarter-acre yards is going to be different than downtown. And you know, we've got to recognize that. Another way to look at it is that, you know, when in the game of golf, you handicap golfers to level the playing field. So with all the data we're collecting, we've got to find a way to handicap different regions. So when we do look at them and compare them, we're comparing apples to apples, oranges to oranges, because right now we're not. And so this person could do a lot of the handicapping, you might say, for different regions, and also enforcement. Enforcement is critical, and this enforcement officer would enforce the regulations and coordinate with water agencies and municipalities to ensure potable water is not wasted or unreasonably used. We need to coordinate model landscape ordinances. And this would be a person that could work with the cities in a jurisdiction and promote and you know, considering the differences in different situations, but be the catalyst to promote cities adopting ordinances on new development, on landscape retrofits, commercial properties, and particularly in some areas like South Orange County. It's almost all residential developments behind closed gates with an HOA. And what we find on a lot of those properties is when they developed them, this wasn't an issue. And so they had a quarter of acre in this corner, a half acre in this corner. And what they did is they just created turf, and they have these large fields. And there's one 400-acre leisure world in Rossmore, for example. It's 287 acres, and their water bill is over $1 million a year. And they're looking for what they could do to reduce that. I think another issue is the bottom point on this page is ensure municipalities have ordinances that are compatible. We have a water law clinic at Whittier Law School, and as a project for our senior law students, we have them compare 34 cities and the county in Orange County and compare their ordinances. And out of 35 entities, we found 7, 1 in 5, had issues with converting and transitioning landscapes, and particularly doing anything with your parkway. And so you know, this person in a regional board could also, you know, have a role with that. And continuing, on these 2 issues, I kind of want to get in the weeds a little bit, no pun intended, but you know, develop and promote training programs for the establishment of drought-tolerant landscapes. You know, right now, what we're all focused on and what millions of dollars are being spent on is tear out your turf and put in drought-tolerant. And that's great, but it's not enough. And the issue is, from experience and what we've done, is that once you put in drought tolerant, it takes 2 years for those plants to get established and for those roots to go. And yet, it's different. It's not rocket science, of course, but it's different than what we've all grown up to know. Just examples. Today, when we see a plant and all the leaves are drooping and wilting, our knee-jerk reaction is to pour water on it. On a drought-tolerant plant, you'll kill it.
Right.
There's a number of examples I could give that it's just different than how we've been raised. And so we need training. We need training for everyone, because the worst thing that can happen is that we spend millions of dollars on transitioning landscapes, and then the people find that they aren't properly trained. Their new landscape doesn't survive, and they say, well, we tried that, we'll go back to grass. And so there's no discussion anywhere on how do you assist that property owner, whether it be a commercial, an HOA, personnel, and even city landscapers. And we find, and it goes to the bottom point, we find that even with large landscape contractors, municipal and commercial maintenance, there's a real lack of training in this stuff. We landscaped a 3-acre site for Southern California Edison and trying to get them to change all of their specs. And our deal was we would put this landscape in, we'd maintain it for 2 years, and we would show them all the benefits derived from that. And it was substantial, plus a 45% reduction in the annual O&M, the cost to maintain it. But our biggest fear was this very expensive, very well-tested landscape. When we were done and our 2 years is up, they would put it on the list, the low bidder. And 6 months later, we found that the weather track systems we had put on were all put on default, and they were just watering the heck out of it. We found that some trees we had planted just a year prior, they were out there trimming them, which you don't do. And we found even more alarming is that they were trimming certain plants, and yet they had 4-foot weeds because they didn't know the difference. And so there's a whole realm of training that needs to go on. And let me just quickly go through these. These are additional recommendations. You know, we'd like to see the state board collaborate more with NGOs to provide public outreach and education regarding the state board's mandatory conservation. There's a lot we could do in our networks and our groups. Would like to see green infrastructure and water efficiency as a higher priority in the Clean Water and Safe Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. Would like to encourage water agencies and have you encourage water agencies to take advantage of the Prop 18 protest process in actually getting approval of water-related rates. And ensure future stormwater permits, and this is important to MS4, ensure that going forward, new MS4 permits maximize stormwater retention and integrated watershed management. And we're not even there yet with LID, really, but we need to go further. And then we need to apply the waste and unreasonable use doctrine to define minimum standards for acceptable water use by sector. And that is an easy sentence, but a huge job. But that would get us a long way forward. So I again thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Brick.
There we go, thank you. Good morning. I'm pleased to be here today to represent the Alliance for Water Efficiency, which is I hope you know something about it already. I know that Mary Ann Dickinson and I have already made previous presentations to the State Board on these important water conservation issues, and I'd like to praise the State Board for the very deliberative action that you've taken in order to respond effectively to the drought. I think you've really assumed a leadership position that's appropriate for your agency and one that is of benefit to all of the agencies and organizations throughout California and the residents of California. So thank you for those good efforts. The Alliance for Water Efficiency was founded 7 years ago. It's a North American nonprofit organization, really a campaign that is dedicated to the efficient and sustainable use of water. The Alliance has developed in these 7 years into a very effective advocate for water efficiency policies, programs, and examination of the best practices and research into these very key issues, so that many of the issues we're hearing discussed today have been looked at very carefully by research projects that the Alliance has initiated. We provide technical assistance to water utilities, water professionals, and other water-using stakeholders. Our focus is really have increasingly become water and energy, conservation rates, planning tools, and research on outdoor water use. We're based in Chicago, but 26% of our members are here in California. So we have 400 members nationally, and 100 of them are here in California. So we have a very strong California base. The issues that I'd like to cover briefly are first, measuring reductions from conservation programs and some recommendations on that, replacing inefficient plumbing throughout the state, reducing outdoor water use, reducing water loss in water distribution systems, so distribution system loss, designing drought rates, and designing guidelines for new development for the future. With regard to measuring reduction, it's a very complex process, as I think everyone is learning. All of the different kinds of complexities that really come in, and comparing current monthly percentage reductions across all water providers really is a very imperfect metric. We need to develop an increased sophistication in terms of how we do this, and I think we're kind of still at the beginning of the process in terms of ferreting out what are the most important factors and how to ensure that there's actually a fair, equitable sense of a measurement process. So one of the key factors is that measuring overall efficiency doesn't account for past reductions in pre-drought, but there's also other important climatic conditions, evapotranspiration rates, and other factors like that that are actually important to really give a fair comparison across various agencies.
Can you just stop and talk about, because this is something that people have asked me a lot about. So the key thing, if you look, for example, at some of the inland cities where it's hotter, so it takes more water to keep the same yard. And so then the response becomes, why do they have to have the same kind of yards? To which, because what is fair is in the eyes of the beholder, to which the response then is, well, if evapotranspiration works in multiple ways, if you took away the lawns in some of those hot communities, the communities would get much hotter and uncomfortable and potentially unhealthy. And so there's also a conversation to be had about the difference between lawns, landscapes, trees. Because you definitely want trees, but you also need something else so that the place doesn't become a baking island. So again, the complexity continues, and many people don't understand that.
Yeah, it is very complex, and you know, yes, it requires more water to sustain, you know, a typical landscape such as we've known in the past, particularly in drier areas, and much of the development is going on in drier areas. But on the other hand, we don't want to create an expectation that everybody should have the same amount necessarily of water without taking into account the climatic factors. Another consideration like that that's very similar is the issue of density. You know, cities that have very dense populations, such as San Francisco, inevitably will use less water per capita than other regions.
What's New York? Aren't they the most efficient city?
Yeah, they're very high in efficiency because they're very dense and there's very little outdoor use. And so, you know, it's easy to kind of pretend that that you can come up with an objective measurement, but it's very difficult to actually do it when you count all the factors in. Within the city of Los Angeles, for instance, there's immense difference regionally according to neighborhoods, density, climate. San Fernando Valley is much hotter. You know, other factors like that are actually very important. So we want to have a sophisticated and objective standard, but it's difficult to achieve.
When the speakers get up, Joe Berg is going to be here. He's the first speaker, and he is going to be telling about what Inland Empire or what the Santa Ana region is doing to answer that question directly.
Oh, good.
That's great, but I think one thing that's confounding with the Australian experience is that they actually came down on a number that went across all those ET landscapes.
And then it did drive people to gray water and cisterns and the like to maintain their yards.
Yeah, you know, in the face of complexity, you know.
Yeah, they did set regional standards, though. I was in Australia on a water tour for two weeks in 2009, right in the middle of the whole thing when they were developing all of these processes. And an awful lot of their stuff was based on consciousness stuff, on trying to change people's consciousness. And it still is to this day, and it's an important thing. And I mean, it's not something you can really influence through regulation, but it's, you know, their whole commitment to developing water-sensitive cities, you know, and changing the whole consciousness about how we view our cities and how we view development and how we view natural resources in the environment is really key and needs to be addressed on a much broader scale by our whole society. We need to really convey to people very effectively. I think part of what's going on in the water industry is that we've all worked real hard to take this problem away from people, you know, the problem of water supply and efficient water use. And now we need to go back to the public and say, no, this is all of our problems. We all need to work together to solve this problem.
And they invested far more money in of their communication programs to the public than we or any of the local agencies have.
And subsidization of you know, and they were down, you were right, they were down in the range of, you know, 35 to 45 gallons per person per day. And they, if you look at the old charts from 10 or 15 years ago, Australia was up there at the United States. If you look at global use of water, the United States is way high compared to everyone else in the world, you know. I remember going to an international conference in Mexico City on this and talking about conservation programs in Southern California, and they say, well, you're talking about conservation programs in Southern California, but you're using 4 times more water than any other city on this panel, you know, and it's kind of like, well, you know, that's what we're dealing with. So, you know, these are, but Australia did a terrific job, really, of bringing it down. They had to. They had a very long, very intense drought. And even more importantly than that, they don't call it a drought anymore. They call it permanent climate change.
Yeah, they did focus it around climate change. And they increased their tree canopy in many places goals in the middle of a drought because they were worried about the heat island effect. And that drove incredible investment in LID and other things to capture water to save their trees and parks. It's amazing.
I really think their programs for water-sensitive cities are really outstanding and need to be emulated more in California. Replacing inefficient plumbing, there's still lots of room. Tracy talked about it, lots of room for replacing inefficient toilets. 4 million toilets in the state still using 3.5 to 5 gallons. There's 90,000 acre feet for 20 years. We figure a cost of $333 per acre foot, which is pretty reasonable.
That's pretty cheap.
Very efficient water. Yes.
I want you to know at a conference that Steve and I were at with Australians, one of the most senior members of the Australian government came rushing out of a bathroom horrified by the toilet and how much water it took. She couldn't believe it.
Well, and I think this slide is particularly aimed at Northern California. Southern California has made a lot of fixture changes, but Northern California has just, they haven't even started in a way.
Reducing outdoor water use, obviously. I mean, there are some areas that are 80% of the water use is outdoors. I think the figure that we saw earlier of 54, you know, in the urban areas is more appropriate, but there are still areas that are extremely high, so much more work needs to be done in this area. And, you know, even restrictions that get it down to 3 days a week aren't really very effective in terms of really reducing usage. Comprehensive standards are needed for irrigation equipment efficiency as well, landscape redesign and outdoor water budgeting. Reducing water loss, system water loss is very important. And AWA has a very important manual, Manual 36, which is on distribution system loss and non-revenue water. And it reflects the change in of our perspective with regard to water. So we don't say that water anymore is unaccounted for water, which is a quaint concept that was very popular for many years, but it's really non-revenue water really very important to look at and a very important part of the big picture that needs to be addressed. This manual, which was developed actually by the Cal Nevada section of AWWA 20 years ago and has gone through several reiterations, is a very effective manual for eliminating distribution system losses through audits of the system by the utility, and it may be good for the state board to require annual M36 audits and tracking of performance indicators by water utilities. Designing drought rates are very important too. With lower demand from drought restrictions means reduced sales revenue, and so we need to really unhook that relationship between sales revenue and conservation.
Can I interrupt you since you have so much experience? I mean, I've been saying, and perhaps this is unkind, that not changing your rates and being in a bind is a self-inflicted wound.
It is.
Now, I know it's difficult, but it seems irresponsible, and my apologies to any water agencies out in the audience who haven't changed it, to not realize that you're doing this to yourself.
Yeah. Well, good rate design needs to take all of this into effect, and conservation should not be negative for the revenue stability of a utility. And we've sponsored, with substantial support from foundations around the country, programs on developing revenue stability while doing conservation programs, and really how to unhook that relationship that previously has existed between sales and revenue stability. So we have a very good handbook and rate model that really incorporates the principles, and regional workshops on this would be very valuable for water utilities, and to kind of retrain everybody in the area of rates and conservation so that we could better understand how to ensure that we have efficient water systems and also have water delivery systems that have revenue stability. Because obviously the two really absolutely need to go together.
And I think regular people, I know we tend to be the more expert public, they get water as a service versus a commodity. I mean, it's not that hard of a leap.
That's right. Yeah, water agencies really are delivering a level of service, and that's the way it really needs to be looked at. And that level of service needs to be approached in a broad context. And I think the whole concept of one water is a very important concept here too, where the service includes stormwater capture, it includes flood protection, it includes recycling of water and all of that. That these services really need to be looked at in a more integrated fashion. And people can still have at least the same, if not a better, quality of life really that is more appropriate to their regional environment, with the right kind of approach towards this. So
you're the second one who's really mentioned a heavy emphasis on training. But I think in order for training to actually work, we're going to have to link it to data collection so that we know that there's a product coming out of this that is beneficial to the community. Because we've got a lot of people go to workshops, and then they're too low in the totem pole to actually make the changes that need to be made in their agency. And so
it's just kind of a standard in science and in management that you can't manage something if you can't measure it. And we really need to develop better measurement and more consistency in methodologies for measurement so that they're all the same. I remember a few years ago trying to evaluate per capita consumption from water utilities, and it was just such a frustrating process because everybody had a different way of measuring what was residential use or various other factors like that. So developing a consistent methodology is absolutely critical. So the Alliance has developed manuals that are helpful in this area. One, Building Better Rates in an Uncertain World, We have an AWE sales forecasting and rate model, which is really a very user-friendly tool and is really one of the best services that we provide to water agency managers, and it helps them really deal with this issue of uncertainty with regard to rate making. And then we have a website which provides web-based resources with the latest research and information on financing sustainable water. So all of these are very important resources and tools for all of those who are involved in managing and regulating water. Another key issue as we look to the future are guidelines for new development. New construction really needs to emphasize maximizing water reuse on site, collecting rainwater, maximizing water reuse on the site itself. So we're developing a new overlay land use ordinance for water neutral development in the future, and we hope that communities would adopt it on a voluntary basis, but new development would be required to offset their water use by retrofitting somewhere else in the service area, reusing all water on site, and or storing rain and stormwater for irrigation use. So we're in a process of working. We have a large consortium of experts who are working on this in order to develop an ordinance sometime in 2016. But I think the process that we're going through will really be one that will be very valuable for everyone to study and contribute to, so that we can develop an effective mechanism to really deal with new use.
This is a very good point, and the Local Government Commission is really interested in this nexus as well, moving forward, using the new groundwater legislation as a catalyst to engage counties and cities in land use planning to try to create a nexus with available water resources for their communities, with groundwater being the starting point. But I hope that you'll be able to create a linkage with that process moving forward with this idea of the ordinance.
Good. And let me just say that we appreciate the efforts and the leadership that you've taken, and we'd like to offer our resources in any way we can. As I said, we have 100 members within California, many of them who are the range, really. We have the range from large to small water agencies and organizations, and some corporate members as well. So I think we can provide very valuable services to the state board in your process of trying to develop more sustainable water use for the future.
Thank you. Great. Further questions for the panel? I know we've been asking them as we go along, but I want to give an opportunity.
Well, I have a question about, I kind of like Mr. Brown's idea about handicapping. And just wondering if you could talk a little bit more, actually each of you, about we know it's a complex system. There's no easy way to evaluate, and there's so many different factors. Could something be put together without taking up our entire time over the next several years, so that we could arrive at a way to measure that would be fair and equitable? And you talk about the public consciousness, that in order for the public to be, part of this, they need to own it. So if most of a region's time is spent on, well, that number doesn't work for us because, then we're not able to get to that consciousness that you're talking about.
I think, and something that we're looking at is again, it goes back to measurement. It goes back to how do we understand what we're dealing with, and there's big variances by region, by climate, by design of communities, and it all has an impact on water use. And so one of the things that under the emergency drought grant, that the three counties, San Bernardino, Riverside, and Orange County, and with the 5 major districts, wrote a grant, and it's been approved. And part of those grant funds are going to be used, and maybe Tom Ash will talk about it more. But part of those grant funds are going to be used for a LiDAR system, which basically is kind of a flyover, and it's 3-dimensional, and you can not only measure sites, but you can measure it. It will show you how much moisture It has, and you can identify differences, you can identify and measure sizes of lots. And it's, like I said, it's three-dimensional. You can also determine, you know, if it's mostly trees, shrubs, turf, what. And I think that is gonna take us from just new development standards to actual tracking performance down the road. And hopefully this will be a way that we can do that and try to bring some matrices to that.
Others?
I just want to bring in a related issue to. We have been spending a lot of time trying to describe the water system in Los Angeles County. So we don't call what you call a wholesaler. We talk about, we have importers, we have wholesalers that are buying from the importers, and then we have retailers. In Los Angeles County, just south of the San Gabriel Mountains, there are 100 different water retailers by themselves, some of which are also wholesalers from groundwater. But we have really, in looking at these 100, there's 25 that serve 75% of the population, and there's 75 that serve 25% of the population. That would still put those agencies into the very highest, biggest water suppliers as a group together. So these agencies are serving 5,000, 8,000, 10,000 connections. They don't have the capacity. We haven't been able to find geographic shape files for all of them. They still have their boundaries on paper. They don't have the ability to do anything more than try to serve water. So I think one of the biggest issues is that, especially in urban areas, you're not just dealing with one agency, you're dealing with many, many different ones. So you're gonna have to look at something that is gonna cost money, which is technical assistance. Should the counties be involved with providing this kind of technical assistance, which they're very good at in urban areas? I just think that what we measure and how we measure it is got to do with what the capability to measure is. And so you might want to think about trying to get these figures, while we can, county-wide, because that's where the census data exactly matches the county boundaries too. So it's something that has to be part of the discussion. And so handicapping is like the last step. These are some of the first steps that have to be taken. And if I could say something more about this issue, in Southern California, residents think, even when they are served by local water, they think they're served by imported water. And the messages coming from the importers are quite different than the messages that I heard last week coming from the agencies that were serving Brisbane. When they were 18 months away from not having any water at all, they spent $60 billion getting that community prepared, not only reducing their uses, but interconnecting their systems, providing them with greywater systems. How can our retailers increase their rates when our wholesalers are saying, well, we still have a year of water left? So I think that that's a really big issue here.
Well, it was an issue in prompting us to do our regulations, is when we heard people saying that we're fine, we have 1 to 2 years in storage. It rang all kinds of bells for us looking at the Australian experience, because if you're conserving, you'd have 3 or 4 years in storage. So it was a matter of tremendous concern.
So how do you get to the point where the financial model of the importer and the wholesalers and the retailers can work around creating a scarcity when you should be creating a scarcity?
I think this issue is a real key one, and I'm not sure that even your board can solve this, and that is the governance of the water industry. I would argue is very complex and confused, and it is not clear. The functions overlap widely. There's a disparity in training and resources that various agencies have. I'll never forget, I was in, and one of the things you need to look at, what Australia really did was they reformed the water industry radically.
They did, yeah.
I was in Melbourne, And they said, this was in 2009, so it was the beginning of our drought. Remember 2007 and 2008 were really tough years, and it was 2009. And they said, you know, we used to have 300 water agencies here in Victoria. And I said, how many do you have now? And they said 5. And I said, what period of time were you able to do that over? They said 5. They said, well, we did it just like that. You know, I say, well, that's very interesting because, you know, we're having a drought in Southern California and we're trying to come up with management plans and drought restrictions and ordinances and rate structures that will ensure effective use. And we have 300 water, we have metropolitan, and then we have the regional water agencies, but there's 300 water agencies in metropolitan service territory. So I said it's very interesting because we're having a real difficult time communicating down through all of that chain of command to get to the local customers, and local customers don't know. And you have these disparities where someone is on one side of the street and they have certain restrictions, and on the other side of the street they don't have the same restrictions and things like that. And it's just, I asked the official from Melbourne, you know, how did you do that? And they said, well, we had a crisis, we had a plan. Mm-hmm. That's what we don't have. That's what we're developing. We have a plan, and we had a minister. And I think candidly that the parliamentary system gave more authority to the state, basically, right, to really deal with these things. So the minister basically told all these 300 agencies, there's only going to be 5 of you next year, you know. And I don't think California will ever be able to do that. But I do think there needs to be a look at the governance and the relationship and the integration of the industry. We talk about integrated regional water management. Well, what about integrating the functions really that should exist and coming up with a better structure for delivering water for the next century?
Tracy, any? Okay. Other questions? That was great. All right. We started late. We want to get to the next panel. We want to take the time. This was incredibly valuable, and I appreciate all the thought you all put into your presentations and the conversation. But I don't want to keep going and then take a break right during lunchtime when people really need time. So I'm going to make a judgment that we're going to take a break now in between panels, but we're going to try and go through. So that means plan on a late lunch. So I suggest we take a 15-minute break, but get a snack, because we're not going to be going to lunch between 1 and 2, as I look at the number of cards and the discussion. So 15-minute break now. Make sure you get some food. I mean, I'm not your mother, but I want people's blood sugar up, you know, as we get into in the right place. What? And you're not allowed to eat in this room, which means you've got to find food and drink and eat it out there. So.